Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
On a cold October night in 1995, a high school football game was being held in a small, quiet town in the Midwest. The team had made it to the regional finals, and the entire town packed the stands, buzzing with excitement. The game was fierce, the stakes high, and the air thick with tension. But the atmosphere shifted as the game wore on, something unsettling about it. The visiting team, a group from a neighboring town, had a star player, a tall, lean quarterback named Aaron. He was known for his precision and speed. However, as the game progressed, something strange began to happen. Aaron, who had always been the picture of sportsmanship, seemed different. His movements grew more erratic, and his eyes, once sharp and focused, were now glassy and distant. Late in the third quarter, as the game reached its peak intensity, Aaron ran for a touchdown, dodging defenders with impossible speed. But as he crossed the goal line, the stadium lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the field. The crowd fell into an uneasy silence. Then, without warning, Aaron collapsed on the field, his body jerking uncontrollably. The coaches rushed to his side, along with medical staff, but something was wrong. His heart rate was off the charts, and his pupils had turned an unnatural shade of black. The crowd murmured in disbelief, but that wasn't the most unsettling part. As the paramedics struggled to revive Aaron, they noticed something even stranger. His body, already cold to the touch, began to emit a foul, decaying stench, like something was rotting from the inside. As they loaded him into the ambulance, a low, distant howl echoed from the nearby woods. It was brief but haunting, the sound of something unnatural. The air grew colder, and a dense fog rolled in from the forest, swallowing the field in an instant. The lights above flickered once more before plunging the entire stadium into darkness. The game continued, but the energy had shifted. No one could focus on the score. All eyes were on the field, where Aaron had just fallen. Every player, every coach, every spectator felt as if they were being watched by something far worse than the typical pressure of competition. By the time the game ended, the home team had won, but the victory felt hollow. The town's mood was dark, heavy, as if the events on the field had changed something deep within the air itself. The game was quickly forgotten by all who witnessed it, but the haunting story of that night persisted. Weeks later, the town learned that Aaron had never left the hospital. Doctors had no explanation for his condition. His body, now in a state of complete paralysis, had been declared dead, but his eyes remained wide open, staring into nothingness. It was as if the very soul had been drained from him. Some of the locals, those who still remembered the howl from the woods and the thick fog that had rolled across the field that night, began to whisper about the curse that had been placed on the town long ago, one that claimed the soul of a player every time the town's football team reached the regional finals. They said Aaron had been the last to fall victim to it, but his death was not the end. Instead, they feared something far worse had been awakened. The chilling truth, though, was that as long as the fog lingered and the howls echoed from the woods, the curse would never end. And every October, when the football season came around, the town would remember the night that Aaron fell and the nightmare that followed.
Story number 2.
It was a crisp fall evening in 2002 when a local college decided to hold a midnight soccer match, something that had never been done before. The players were excited, eager to test their skills under the glow of stadium lights, with the added thrill of playing at night. The game was between two rival colleges, one of which, a small but determined team, had an unspoken history of strange occurrences, almost like they were cursed. Their victories came with eerie coincidences and unsettling events. The game began as usual, with the teams on either side of the field, players warming up and bantering with one another. But something felt different that night. The air was thick with unease. The sound of the ball being kicked felt muted, as if the stadium itself was holding its breath. Even the usual chatter of the crowd seemed quieter, almost hollow. As the match went on, one player from the rival team, James, began to act strangely. At first, his moves were flawless, faster, more fluid than anyone had ever seen. But as the game progressed, he started to play with an intensity that was almost too fierce, almost unnatural. His eyes, once calm and focused, were now wild and bloodshot. Sweat dripped from his face, but his expression remained vacant, almost detached, as if his body was running on autopilot. At one point, he collided with an opponent mid-air, both players landing hard on the ground. But James didn't get up. His opponent scrambled to his feet, confused as to why James was lying there motionless, his chest barely rising and falling. The other players gathered around him, but as they did, a chilling, guttural sound filled the stadium, like someone was choking, but it wasn't coming from James. It was coming from all around them. Suddenly, James jerked upright with a violent spasm, and the sound stopped as abruptly as it had begun. His face, now twisted in a grotesque grin, seemed alien, as though his soul had been replaced with something darker, something inhuman. His teammates froze, unsure of what to do, their minds racing through 1,000 different explanations, none of them making sense. Then, with no warning, James launched himself at the ball with terrifying speed, his body moving in unnatural angles. Every time he touched the ball, it seemed to move faster, almost as if it was being pushed by something beyond human control. The game continued, but it was no longer a game. There was something wrong in the air, an oppressive weight that had descended on the field. The match ended, but no one celebrated. The players of the rival team didn't even shake hands. They were too rattled, too confused. James didn't speak to anyone. He didn't even acknowledge the other players as he walked off the field. His eyes glazed, his grin still fixed on his face like a puppet with its strings pulled by some unseen force. The next morning, when the team showed up for their next practice, they found something horrifying. James was lying motionless on the field, his body contorted in unnatural ways, as if he had been twisted from the inside out. His teammates tried to wake him, but it was clear something was wrong. His pulse was steady, but his eyes were wide open, and they weren't his eyes anymore. The doctors could find no medical explanation. His body wasn't injured. It was just empty. The game had been a turning point, something that had triggered a chain of events no one understood. Some of the players who had been on the field that night started experiencing strange things too. One reported hearing footsteps following him when no one was there. Another player woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in cold sweat, his hands tightly clenched as though he had been gripping something, though there was nothing around him. As for James, he was never the same. He returned to the team, but his presence was unsettling. He played, but it was like he was a different person entirely. The grin never left his face. His eyes never blinked. And sometimes, just sometimes, when you looked at him for too long, you could swear you saw something moving beneath his skin, something that wasn't human. The team finished that season without any more incidents, but the rumors about James and the midnight game spread far and wide. No one knew for sure what happened that night, but the older players, the ones who had heard the whispers, knew to stay away from the field at night, and the curse that seemed to haunt that particular college soccer team, it never truly went away. It lurked in the shadows, waiting for the next victim to fall prey to it. Because some games, no matter how thrilling, shouldn't be played after dark.
Story number 3.
It was a chilly winter evening in 1998 when the local high school basketball team, a group of highly talented yet slightly superstitious players, traveled to a small town on the outskirts of the city for what was supposed to be just another regional tournament game. The gym was older, its wood floors creaking underfoot, the bleachers rustling with the restless energy of the crowd. Everything seemed normal, except for one thing. The coach, a grizzled man named Coach Moore, had made it clear to his team that this was a must-win game. There was something about the opposing team that unnerved him, but he never explained why. The opposing team, the Ridgewood Hawks, had a reputation for being eerily good, almost too good for a small-town school. Players on that team, especially their star player, Evan, were known for their almost otherworldly abilities on the court. Evan was a tall, intimidating figure with eyes that never seemed to blink and movements that were unnervingly smooth. His style of play was unlike anything the opposing team had ever seen. It was almost like he wasn't playing by the same rules as everyone else. As the game began, everything seemed fine. The high school team quickly got into rhythm, outscoring the Hawks in the first quarter. But by the second quarter, something began to shift. The Ridgewood Hawks started playing with a ferocity that seemed unnatural. Their movements became faster, sharper, and eerily coordinated, as if they had some invisible advantage that the other team didn't. Then, in the middle of the third quarter, with the game tied and both teams on edge, Evan, without explanation, started playing at a pace that defied human capability. He was everywhere on the court, covering ground with impossible speed, making shots from all corners in ways that no human could replicate. He seemed to be in several places at once, his body bending and twisting in ways that made the crowd's skin crawl. The tension in the gym grew as the scoreboard flickered erratically, the lights above dimming every few seconds, casting long shadows that stretched across the court. Fans in the stands began to murmur, and the players on both teams seemed distracted by the growing unease in the air. That's when the odd occurrences began. One of the players on the visiting team, Mark, went up for a layup, only to be stopped midair by an invisible force. His body jerked and froze for a split second before crashing violently to the ground. He lay there for a moment, disoriented, his eyes wide with terror, as though something had been in the air, pulling at his limbs. But when he tried to get up, he looked around, only to see Evan standing motionless at the far end of the court, his eyes fixed on Mark like a predator. At first, the team tried to shake it off, but then the bench began to notice something even more disturbing. Evan wasn't moving. He was simply watching. Not just watching the game, but watching the players, like he was waiting for something. And then, without warning, a loud crack echoed through the gym as one of the basketball nets snapped. The lights flickered once more, and the room seemed to get colder. The visitors began to feel it too. The energy in the gym was oppressive, like a storm was about to break, and the ball, when it passed through their hands, felt heavier, almost as if something else was controlling it. The strange occurrences grew even more bizarre. One player's sneakers squeaked louder than normal, the sound becoming deafening, almost like it was echoing from within his own head. Another player, during a timeout, felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something was lurking just behind him, watching his every move. And then, at the final buzzer, Evan scored an impossible basket, an almost half-court shot that seemed to defy gravity. The ball sailed through the air, spinning with unnatural speed, and dropped through the net as if guided by some invisible force. The gym erupted into a mix of cheers and confusion, but something was off. Evan stood there for a moment, a sinister smile spreading across his face. His teammates, unnervingly still, seemed to be waiting for his next move. The visiting team was too rattled to celebrate their loss. The feeling in the gym had grown darker. As the teams filed off the court, Coach Moore pulled the players into the locker room, his face pale and sweating. He muttered something under his breath, something about the game being cursed. The team was confused, unsure of what he meant, but he refused to explain further. He ordered them to leave quickly, and as they piled into the bus to head home, the players couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had just transpired. The next day, news broke that the Ridgewood Hawks had been involved in several other strange occurrences in their past games. Local rumors began to spread that the team had made a deal with a mysterious figure, a shadowy entity that lived in the woods near their town. It was said that the deal granted them unmatched skill on the court, but at a terrible price: their souls. Evan was never seen again. Some said he had disappeared overnight, while others claimed he had simply left the town as though he never existed. But the games continued, and the curse lingered like a dark cloud over the town of Ridgewood. And every year, when the basketball season rolled around, strange things began to happen again. Players would fall ill, the lights would flicker, and the sound of the basketball bouncing on the court would sometimes echo in the middle of the night, long after the gym had emptied. The high school team that had played against the Hawks that night, they never returned to Ridgewood. And to this day, no one knows exactly what happened to them or what Evan's true purpose was. But those who dare to visit Ridgewood now hear strange things in the night. The sound of a basketball bouncing endlessly in the distance, a whisper on the wind, and the unmistakable feeling that someone is still watching.
Story number 4.
It was a quiet Sunday evening in 2011 when a group of friends decided to take part in a seemingly innocent weekend hiking trip through the dense forests surrounding their college campus. The group had grown tired of the usual weekend parties and thought the fresh air and tranquility of nature would be a welcome change. They were experienced hikers, well prepared with maps, flashlights, and enough food and water to last the trip. Little did they know, their adventure would soon take a terrifying turn. They had heard rumors about the woods. Locals whispered about strange happenings in the area, but the group brushed it off as nothing more than ghost stories meant to scare outsiders. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the trees grew thicker, blocking out much of the fading daylight. The sounds of the city behind them faded, and the only sounds left were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional call of a distant bird. Around dusk, they stumbled upon a small, abandoned cabin hidden beneath the thick canopy of trees. It was an old structure, weathered and dilapidated, but still standing. The group, curious but cautious, approached the cabin. It looked like no one had been there for years. The wooden door creaked as they pushed it open, the inside covered in dust and cobwebs. The air inside was stale, and the faint smell of mildew lingered. One of the friends, Sarah, noticed something strange as she explored the cabin. Tucked in a corner, she found a large, faded photograph, its edges curled with age. It was a picture of a man and a woman, both smiling, standing in front of the very cabin they had just entered. But there was something wrong about their smiles. Their eyes were cold, almost dead, and there was an unnatural, twisted quality to their faces. "Hey guys, you should see this," Sarah called out, holding the photograph up for the group to examine. As her friends crowded around her, one of them, Mark, noticed something even more disturbing. A small, handwritten note on the back of the photo. It read, "They never leave, neither will you." Chilled by the note, the group decided it was best to leave the cabin and continue their hike. They were unnerved, but tried to brush off the odd experience, assuming it was just an old photograph and some local legend. However, as they retraced their steps toward the trail, something felt off. The air had grown colder, and the sounds of the forest had gone eerily quiet. They stopped to rest near a large boulder, trying to shake the unease that had settled over them. It wasn't long before they realized they were lost. The trail they had been following had disappeared, and all they could see were dense trees and shadows. Panic began to set in. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and without a clear path to follow, they were now trapped in the growing darkness. They tried using their phones to call for help, but there was no signal. The forest seemed to swallow up any trace of civilization. After hours of walking in circles, they stumbled back upon the abandoned cabin. This time, the door was ajar, as if it had been waiting for them. The group hesitated, but desperation led them to enter. Inside, the air felt even heavier than before, and the room was now colder. As they made their way further inside, they noticed something chilling. The photograph Sarah had found was now hanging on the wall, its edges perfectly straight, as though it had been freshly placed there. Then, the door slammed shut behind them. The group spun around in fear, their breaths shallow and frantic. There was no wind outside, nothing to explain the door's sudden movement. The small cabin now felt like a trap. The only source of light was their flashlights, and when they shined them around the room, they saw something even more horrifying. In the corner of the cabin, where the photograph had originally been found, there was now a figure standing in the shadows, tall, dark, and impossible to make out. The figure's eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. For a moment, they thought it might be a person, but the longer they stared, the more they realized it wasn't. The eyes didn't blink, and its presence seemed wrong, like it was not truly there. "Who's there?" Mark called out, his voice trembling. There was no response. But then the figure stepped forward, and as it did, its face became clearer. It was the man and woman from the photograph, their smiles now twisted into grotesque, unnatural grins. Their eyes were completely black, empty voids, and their skin looked as though it had been drained of all color. The group screamed and rushed for the door, but it was locked, sealed from the outside. The room around them began to distort, the walls stretching and contorting in impossible angles. The air became thick with the smell of decay, and they could hear whispers, soft but growing louder, all around them. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, like the very cabin itself was alive, breathing, watching them. In a panic, they scrambled to the windows, but they were covered in layers of grime and dust, as though no one had looked out of them for years. The whispers grew louder, becoming more frantic, more insistent, until one of them, a terrified, panicked voice shouted, "You never leave!" And then everything stopped. The whispers, the noise, the light. The group stood in silence for a long moment, too afraid to move, too afraid to even breathe. Finally, Sarah, her voice barely a whisper, said, "We need to get out, now." But when they turned around to leave, they found themselves standing in the same spot, staring at the same walls, the same photograph. Nothing had changed. It was as if they had never left. The group was never seen again. Years later, local hikers reported hearing faint whispers in the forest near that same cabin. Some said they saw figures in the windows of the cabin at night, staring out into the dark woods, waiting for someone to step inside. The photograph that once hung inside the cabin had vanished, but it said that if you look closely at the cabin's decaying exterior, you can still see faint imprints of the faces, those twisted, haunting smiles etched into the walls, and the whispers, they still linger just beyond the trees.